Nice to meet you. Yeah, beautiful work.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you all for being here today. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Millicent Rogers Museum. I'm Michelle Lanteri. I'm the Curator of Collections and Exhibitions here. And I would like to first honor the Taos speaking peoples on whose land we stand. And we're so excited to present the second discussion in our curated conversation series for this exhibition, Southwest Reflections in Between Shadows of the Land. So as the second installment of the Millicent Rogers Museum's New Mexico Artist Series, Southwest Reflections offers a diverse exploration of 9 New Mexico artists' portrayals of environmental relationships and the ways that these events become conveyed through shadows, reflections, and movements. And so the featured artists in this exhibition are as follows. So Matthew and Julie Chase Daniel, and this is Matthew Chase Daniel here. Brandon Adriano Ortiz, right here. Dora Dillistone, Juanita J. Lavadie, Lorraine Gala Lewis, Pola Lopez, Collette Marie, and then also Will Wilson. So it's really such an honor to be able to work with these amazing artists here in New Mexico. And that's kind of one of the best things about being in New Mexico is that people are making really different work from each other. So, we're able to look at these themes, and especially now, these relationships to place. So I'd also like to thank the following organizations for their generous support. And those are New Mexico Arts, the Taos Community Foundation, and then also Los Alamos National Laboratory Foundation. So today's curated conversations topic is cultural imprints, light, shadow, and transformation in art. And so I'm really honored today to be here in dialogue with these 2 artists. Thank you for being here.
Okay. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, likewise.
So it's my pleasure to introduce both of the artists here. So Brandon Adriano Ortiz is a member of the Taos Pueblo community and a member of the interconnected web that is Northern New Mexico Heritage. He's a recent graduate of the Masters of Architecture program at University of New Mexico, SAAP, and he's a traditional micaceous potter. And this is kind of funny, I'm going to quote you with you right next to me. So Brandon writes, "I started ceramics on a whim and it has become such a central part of who I am. A teacher and a friend, it has guided me through stresses and into places I could have never dreamed. The clay is a teacher of patience, loss, and communication. It has changed the way in which he views the world and the way that he lives in it. These reflections are put into each pot, and I hope that they bring as much joy into their future homes as they have for Brandon." So I know that was kind of an interesting thing. I actually used that quote for some of the press materials that we shared, but it's a really different thing, just thinking about how the pronouns work with you being right at this table. So thank you for being here. And Matthew Chase Daniel works with his wife, Julie Chase Daniel, and they're based in Santa Fe. Unfortunately, Julie was unable to join us today, but she has been able to visit the exhibition and we're really grateful for her work too. So Matthew was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1965, and he lived in New York City in the 1960s. His photography and sculpture have been exhibited across the US and in Europe. He is the co-founder, co-owner, and co-curator of Axel Contemporary, which is a mobile art space. He's also a radio podcast host at Coffee and Culture, and he's the curator of the Lena Wall, and also a member of the Rail Yard Art Committee, which all of this is in Santa Fe. So Matthew studied at the Ojai Foundation in Ojai, California, at the Sarah Lawrence College in Bronxville, New York, and also in Paris, France, where he studied cultural anthropology, photography, and ethnographic film production at the École Pratique des Hautes Études et Sorbonne. Thank you. Thank you, Matthew. we'll have a discussion. We're really looking forward to talking about the intersections between these two artists, and then we'll ask for any questions that you guys have as well. So let's go ahead and get started. Brandon, if you'd like to start, how long have you been making art, and can you talk to us a bit about your background as an artist?
Yeah, sure. I'll have to get used to speaking on the mic. I've never really done this, so I've really only been creating pottery or artwork for the last maybe 5-6 years, and that's always been, you know, part-time, on and off. I was going to school. For architecture, and just kind of on a whim went to a craft lab and picked up a bit of clay, and I've been going at it since. And it's really been a healing thing for me.
And did you start off with clay as your primary medium, or how did that come about?
So while I was at architecture school, we would create a lot of different models of the houses we were designing. And so it was a lot of paperwork, woodwork, and we would make these 3D models to sort of, you know, create a space that the mind could sort of envision being within. And so that was really one of the first ways that I created some sort of artwork. Prior to that, I'd always worked with small crafts, you know, picking up this scrap wood that my dad would have laying around when he fixed houses. I would, you know, glue them together, or shape them into swords and play in the yard. But that was really the start of it. It was just making whatever I thought. And yeah, it transitioned from there.
I have a question for you, actually. In studying architecture, being from Taos, Pueblo, the strong tradition of adobe architecture throughout New Mexico, and especially here, is that in terms of making those models as an architecture student and the history of adobe and then working clay, is there any connection there for you?
Yeah, thank you. It's something that I hadn't necessarily thought of in the very beginning. I was just thinking, you know, as a teenager, you grow up and you sort of resent where you come from, or at least push against it. But I had grown up sort of in the shadow of the Pueblo, just to the south side of it, an adobe house. And, you know, me and my like 3 siblings were sharing a 1-bedroom house. And so when I went to architecture school, it was all concrete, steel, glass. And I was making these models with materials that I wasn't necessarily familiar with. And so when I had started working with pottery, I began to think of it in that same way, right? It's the building spaces that we can inhabit from the ground around us, in the same way that the Pueblo is built from our environment for us. Yeah.
And so, yeah, and Matthew, yeah, if you wanted to tell us about your background making art, and maybe even how you got to the cyanotypes.
Yeah, the cyanotypes are a new form for me and for Julie and I both. I've been making art since I was a little kid. I grew up in a family of where creativity and art making, my mother was a poet, so those sorts of activities were encouraged. There wasn't pressure to become like a doctor or a lawyer. And so I think I showed some like watercolor paintings of songbirds that I copied out of Roger Tory Peterson field guides at the bookstore in my little town when I was 11, I think was the first time I showed work. And then went to school and did all different things, and throughout have made art. I've also worked making buildings, renovating old buildings when I was in Paris, in New York, in California, and in New Mexico mostly. And then a lot of my work was sculptural work. And so it was the skills and the problem solving were related to the house building stuff. So I used the same saws and the same knives and the same for all of those things. In more recent years, I started doing photography. I studied it as a kid in grammar school, black and white, darkroom work, film photography, 35mm film photography. And then I had studied filmmaking when I was in Paris. But then in 2000, I started making a series of photographs that were many shots of a landscape, often on the ocean, assembled into one image. So there'd be 32 or 48 images sort of making one big print. I started that analog, taping photos together, and but soon wanted to have some sort of finished product. So I hired some guy to come over to my house for an hour, show me how to use Photoshop and how to assemble things together, and started printing those, excuse me, as iris prints and then later as inkjet prints on an Epson printer. The cyanotypes were a solution. I was just telling the young man in the back here that I couldn't remember if Julia wanted to do cyanotypes and then the border wall came as a thing to photograph with them, or if it was the other way around. I think it was the other way around, but I'm not sure. It all blurs like they blur. And so what these are directly exposed using the shadows of the plants or of the wall itself. So there's no negative, there's no digital file. It's just photosensitive emulsion painted on these, wrapped up in a light-proof bag, taken to the border, unrolled and held up against these reeds or against this fence for 5 minutes as still as possible. And so the reason for cyanotypes is the medium is relatively affordable and it's direct, and it's got this incredibly beautiful blue. Even if there were no image and they were just solid blue, they would be beautiful, I think. So it makes our job a little easier. Yeah, it's just a way of capturing something directly. So it's the shadow. And so the light comes from the Mexican side of the wall, comes through the wall, and lands in the United States side of the wall, especially in the middle of winter when the sun is in the southern sky. So there's a whole sort of technical thing, the time of day, the time of year, how close to the object that's casting the shadow you need to be to get a clear image. And that's something that we've just experimented with in our driveway at home. And then as we make prints along the border, so many of the prints we've made didn't work and others came out really nice. And as we're still in the process of this, and as we do it, a greater percentage come out well, but there's still some that fail utterly, so.
And so, yeah, that's a lot from both of you. Thank you so much for sharing. So I kind of feel like switching up the questions that I gave to you guys, but still within the bounds of what we looked at. So I think we're kind of getting to the shadows part like right away. I feel like that's taking kind of center stage with the conversation already. And so I was just wondering, maybe we can talk about how the shadows play a role on a lot of different levels in your artwork. And Brandon, if you'd like to start.
Sure. Yeah, it's always been an element of my work, the smoke clouds or the smoke shadows that you kind of see in and around and on the surface of the pots. And it's, if you're unfamiliar with the process, during the firing process, wherever wood is allowed to burn against the surface of the pot, it'll imprint and sort of trap that carbon within the walls of the clay, and it sort of will tell the story of whatever was going on within this firing process, what fuel you were using, where all of the pots were situated within this one firing, what the wind was like, where things were getting trapped and when they were allowed to go. And so it tells a sort of story of interconnectedness And it sort of acts like I like to think of it as sort of a Rorschach test, right? Something that sort of captures the mood or the thoughts of that moment. My teacher, Clarence Cruz, when he was teaching me pottery at first, he said that the clay is a very porous material. Not only does it absorb, water and these different elemental forces out in, where I dig it up or where it's sitting, but it also absorbs your emotions, your thoughts while you're working on it, and sort of the emotions around it. So they teach you never really to work with clay when you're in a bad headspace, because it will absorb that sort of bad energy, eventually pop or crack. And on this pot here, you can see there's some stress cracks from where, maybe I was working too fast and it sort of embodied into the surface of the clay. But these clouds sort of take that over. And you can sort of manipulate the fire in a certain way to get more or less clouds, but you can never really control them. So it's a story, a conversation between me and the fire, which is really special to see come out. And I actually have been staring at this piece pretty nonstop because I love the wispiness and the way the movement between the beats. There's, you're trying to get a clear image, but I love the moments where you see the movement with the jumps.
On this, there's, the whitest parts are where the reeds are pressed up against the cloth. So like at the top, especially, you can see that super crisp image because there's something pressed against there and not moving. And then you see movement in these ones that are moving further back. And similar, I think there's a correlation in terms of your work and this work in that it's very highly crafted and there's a lot of technique and intention, but there's also a letting go of that and allowing the smoke to come where it comes and the cracks to come where they come if they come. And the same on this, we don't know. We know we have a goal, something we're envisioning in our mind, but it doesn't necessarily have to come out that way to be successful. And there's also just that process oriented. You're taking the clay from the land and you're forming it and you're firing it, and your state of being is being affected and affecting the pot. And this, they're pretty images, but there's also a lot of meaning in terms of why we're doing it, how we're doing it. We're trying to do, it's a 1,900-mile border from San Diego, California to Brownsville, Texas. So we're traveling that whole length, doing one of these every 100 miles or so, plus places where rivers cross, where there's, or the different border crossings and special places along the way. And so it's very much witnessing and documentation of what the border is. We started this during Trump administration, where there was go, build a wall energy. We've continued it, and we're back down along the Rio Grande, going towards Brownsville this April. And there's still wall building in the Biden administration from the federal government and from the state of Texas. And it's still very much as much an issue as it was in the Trump administration. We just don't hear about it quite as much because Biden doesn't yell about it quite as much.
Thank you both so much. I feel like we're really on this road now to also talk about the influences. You guys have touched on a number of things now already. What would you say at this point, as the years are passing and things are changing, are the guiding forces of your practices? What are those, and how do those change as the world changes with us?
I think there are things happening politically in this country and with climate change in the planet that are disturbing and important to address. And I feel like I don't think my work was ever just about making something beautiful for the sake of its beauty. There's always other meanings there, but I think those issues have come more to the forefront of my work. Both my individual work, my work with Julie, my work with Axel. We just finished a portrait project with Axel Contemporary. We were actually here a couple months ago. So it was 2 months on the road. We took 1,372 portraits of people throughout northern New Mexico. And so it was just, felt like this sort of counterpoint to this like division in the country of like red and blue and good and bad and all these ways that we characterize each other more and more easily and readily. And these were so many different individuals of different political leanings and gender and all sorts of identity and wealth. And, you know, in Chama last week, we shot a photo of the mayor, and 10 minutes later, we shot a photo of a guy who's living under the bridge. And so it's, those things are more and more important to me in my work than they used to be.
I think the play too never really had an intended mission behind it, other than when I was at school as a means to reconnect back home and to, you know, continue this tradition, which, you know, there's not very many potters right now. But as I've moved forward with it, you continually go out to the same places to dig from the same pits. And you see the way that the land has shifted, even so suddenly. You see the factors going on around it. And so the place where I dig this clay is actually right near where the fires come from, or where the recent fires were. And so that gave me a lot of new thoughts about, you know, how the smoke is a part of the clay and how all of the different environmental forces are ingrained within the surface of the clay. And even just the process of digging it, you know, you go out and you have to pull trash, and you're in this, what should be a pristine environment, right? This place we should take care of, and yeah, just continually digging up trash on it. But I've never, I mean, Micaceous clay has a history of being utilitarian body, and so it's never really had expressed an artistic motive or any sort of symbols, and so it's just been a tool. And so there's not many avenues in which I've thought about it in connection to that. But oh man, I lost my train of thought. But I think even its existence as an object is a force of cultural preservation, a pushback of for the Pueblo, and a continuance of this lineage. Yeah, itself.
Thank you. Yeah, and that's a great segue too. It's a kind of the topic of this talk today. So, how does the concept of cultural imprint factor into both of your work?
Cultural imprint in what way? How do you define that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question that you're tossing back at me. And I think it's on a lot of levels. I think it's, you know, when you're making the work, how you're contributing to cultural exchange, you know, and I think also the work as artistic, but also documentary. So in that sense of imprint. And then I think on another layer too, you could look at cultural in terms of cross-cultural too.
Yeah, I mean, so there's cultural influences in my work and in this work, and there's then what you hope to achieve through making it, whether that's documentary or artistic, or inevitably the combination of the two. So, you know, I spent in the 1980s I spent a lot of time on the coast near Seattle working with indigenous carvers, wood carvers there, learning their technique and their approach to thinking about work. And that was very influential in my way of thinking. And then later I studied anthropology and looking at art through an anthropological lens around the planet. And so there were even things that weren't necessarily considered art, because that distinction of art and other practices is not always present in every culture. So there's like funeral rites in Borneo where these platforms are built high up in a tree and a body is placed up there. Or a box with bones is placed high up in a tree. And those things just influenced my sculptural work and my way of thinking about things. And I just had a passion for watching films of peoples from around the world and just learning about that. And of course, now there's conversations about appropriation and all of doing work influenced by other cultures is complicated. And so I make an effort to be respectful of that to the degree I can be, and not make work that's looks like other work from other cultures. So there's that cultural imprint on me in terms of my work, you know, but there's also, you know, the work of Matisse and Gauguin and, you know, and Calder and tons of artists within the Western tradition who have had huge influence on me, but also, you know, cartoons I watched as a kid, things that weren't considered art, you know. So it's a constant absorption of culture and then assimilating it and blending it up in my little Waring blender and spitting it back out in a different way. And what I was saying before about wanting to make work that addresses things like climate change or identity, migration, things like that. So this documentation of the border wall, hopefully, when the project is finished, there will be writing with it as well, telling the stories of how it's made, of people we met along the way, of different attitudes. And it's still unknown what degree that will be a part of the final project. But it's instructive to be there on site on the border and talking to people whose lives are there, whether it's Border Patrol or migrants or landowners, and the real complicated issues that at a distance feel simpler from here. And when you get there, they're less simple. And to really be in a place where we can hear what people are saying and why they're saying it has been instructive, and to maybe impart some of that to a larger audience has some importance to me in the project.
I love a lot of what you said. I made me think about a few things, how I think that the objects and the artwork, and even if it's not considered artwork, right, mirror the people that it comes from and the forces around it, right? So in a lot of ways, I think that the clay and the pottery is really a mirror of our people at Taos and of a lot of different pueblos, and it sort of shows this cross community communications network where I actually work with the clay out in Greece, and so the forces within it is actually a lot of what combines us. But where was it? I'm sorry. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of value in the clay itself and the story that goes behind it, right? So when it used to be a tool, and then the shift of when it became a valuable piece of artwork has mirrored the shift of how we see a lot of indigenous communities the tourist value versus the beauty that's there within our own society.
Yeah, it's interesting looking at like the collection here at the museum of pottery, or even more so like in Santa Fe at the School for Advanced Research, where it's just this, like thousands and thousands of pots, and they're incredibly beautiful, but it's also obscene to me in a way that people have come and just like want to acquire that much when they're not necessarily made that way. I mean, they were made that way at a certain point for sale and for a tourist or an art market, but I think that's maybe a little of what you're getting at is like these things are made as part of culture, whether they're functional to cook food or carry water or store seeds, or whether there's actually design on them that has to do with what we call religious meanings or ceremonial meanings. Interesting, that whole shift.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a separation, you said, of the art and the function. And I think that a lot of my work is trying to break down that boundary a little bit to show that living and interacting with things can be as beautiful as a stationary piece of object and can still hold that same symbolic value and can evolve, you know. Like you said, the collections at the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe are studying, and a lot of them sales, pre-tourism, all of that, like a monetary value attached to it.
Yeah.
They're beautiful for the sake of their relation to us and what we could do for each other. And I think that while there's masters who, you know, perfected the forms, perfected these clays, perfected, you know, how thin you can get a wall, the beauty is in the use and the shapes and the spaces that they create. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm looking forward with it.
Yeah, thank you both so much. Yeah, it's so, you know, just hearing you guys talk, I think also this aspect of cultural imprint has a lot to do with recording a moment in an artistic form. And so that just that idea of imprint as, you know, this is something unique to these conditions that's happened right now, and then the ability to be able to reflect on it in terms of the artwork itself, and then also see how it connects to, you know, the next artworks that you all make. And, you know, I think it's really important what both of you were saying too about just bridging different time periods. It's really sounding like, you know, the artworks themselves also as a cultural imprint, they have a materiality, they connect these different time periods, and, you know, and I think that's how we're able to see change too, is, you know, by reflecting on the artworks, looking at what came before, what came after, and then, you know, we're here because of place. So, you know, Brandon, with your clay, with working with this clay that's of here, this was so important to the show because this clay is here. This clay is this place in which we are. So it's hard to put into words, but I think just that's really where that visual comes in, is like being able to look at this, and then you're looking at here, and then you're able to, you know, inside this constructed space, you're able to talk about, you know, what it means to be in this particular place. And I think too, with your work, that you're really, you know, bridging the space of art and talking about the history of the micaceous clay, because your vessel types here, like you're talking about cooking, you're talking about nourishment, and then that carrying on of nourishment, but, you know, into the museum space and into this exhibition that we're talking about. So thank you for what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's such a good image, a good connection between a pot and a building like this that's made of adobe, that's also made of this place, the same ground, and built up in a similar way, right? You start with the base and coil up these successive layers of adobe and clay, and you eventually have a space which you can occupy. And I think these small gestures are sort of a hint or I don't know, something that says, that this is good, this is, can support us. And, tying to my architecture background, I think that, I don't know, I see a lot of moves towards, modern materials, but I think there is a beauty in the simple and like tried and true method of what's been developed too.
Yeah, definitely. And then, thinking about how that connects to Matthew and Julia J. Daniel's work too, that through these cyanotypes, there's a moment that's being recorded, and how, there's a similarity between the series of pottery that Brandon Ortiz is making, where each one of these is part of a series that's a puzzle piece that is kind of, it's all telling a story that, it's telling the story of a moment, of a place and time. And I think with the cyanotypes, you're getting these different views of specific places too. So, with the works that we're featuring here today, the intention with these 4 cyanotypes was really to try to show a rounded out sampling of the series that you're working on, and be able to say, like, some of these are going to focus on the reeds, and then some are going to focus on the wall and the combinations of the two, but then even the variation in the botanicals that you're around. And with Brandon's work, we have a bunch of his artworks right here in the cases, and you can see the diversity, from this kind of really sculptural piece that almost starts taking on like a human type form, anatomical type form, to the next 2 cases where you've got, kind of an open bowl and then some more kind of more closed bowls, and then even, at the end with the steps kind of, talking about the architecture that you see and the symbols and photoculture that you see. So I just, I think that the dialogue between these, what seem to be very different medium, that we're working in, I think that there's just a lot to connect with in terms of how the imprints are made. So, with the fire clouds on the pottery and then seeing the white areas on the cyanotypes, just kind of like that moment of creating, there's like sort of a flash moment of creating it, and it has everything to do with light. It has everything to do with light and shadows. And so we could talk about transformation too. Are there things about transformation that you guys would like to share about your work, about these series?
Well, just a little bit, please, on what you were saying before about that these 4 sort of represent this variation in the work. And part of why we wanted to start this series when we did is because the border wall was being built by Trump, and it was a monolith, basically. It was becoming, the vision for it was that it was one continuous wall, the whole border, and it was 30-foot high steel square pipe set in concrete. And what was interesting as we went down there was that there were different presidential federal administrations over the years have torn out walls and built their own wall. Like everyone wants their own wall. So like this one here is like George Bush era, basically just a vehicle barrier out in the Camino del Diablo, like south of Yuma, out way in the extreme desert, like easy to walk over. This bar here is, like 2 or 3 feet above the ground. You can easily get under it or over it. So that's all being torn out when we were there. And there are these huge heaps of scrap metal and broken concrete, and then the new wall going up. And then like that'll change again. Now maybe the wall will get torn down, and then that'll get recycled. And so in terms of transformation, there's the border is this sort of contested space that is constantly being transformed and made different through technology, through drones and hot air balloons and survey heat cameras and steel and concrete and border patrol and people crossing and government, the border wasn't always where it is now, it was up in way north of here, 150 years ago or so. And then there's many places where there is no wall, like there's not much wall in Texas. Through all of Big Bend National Park, and a lot of it, it's the river is the border, and there's no way to build a wall on the river. And so the wall is being built half a mile or a mile from the river. And so this relationship of the land, the river is the lifeblood of that area. It's a desert. And so the Rio Grande is a big river, as the name would suggest. And so the communities are now being cut off from the river itself, which is tragic. And so there's ecological things for nature and for humanity that are very significant along there. So we're trying to capture that moment of transformation, and we get very, it gets, as we drive and walk and hike and climb around, we'll see a little piece of fence or wall, or like, oh, look at this one, it's made out of this whole other material, and so the fence at Douglas, Arizona is different from the fence in Tacoma, California, or whatever, and trying to capture what is there while it's still there, because it was all disappearing and changing. And so it felt like capturing a moment that was in the midst of transformation and fixing it with these images. I don't know if that answered the question at all.
That was great. I had a lot of things to talk about your work, actually, more than mine.
Yeah, please. Go for it.
But with my work, the only thing I can say is, like you said, there's a sort of flash moment, sort of like a camera when you put the pots into the fire, like a dull gray, and they come out with the imprint of sort of the moment of the conditions of that fire at that moment. And I love to think of it as sort of the clouds rolling over, a pretty complicated hill, and you just see it adapt to the floor. But I love that split second where you start to see it peek out of the fire and you see the clouds on there. But thinking of your work, I would love, I love them as individuals. I would love to see them all lined up,
Me too.
Yeah. But I think the choice of the cyanotype, the blue, is such a great pairing for this because it highlights the spaces outside of the wall, right? It sort of
Right. It's the
almost
blue of the
nullifies
sky.
it. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And so seeing them all up together, it highlights almost everything. But it does highlight the wall, but it sort of erases it in a way too.
Thank you.
I think that's sort of beautiful.
I like that observation. That's good.
And also, one thing that kind of came about this project too was thinking like, well, what are the commonalities? And in terms of presenting it to you all, to be presenting it to the community here, what are the commonalities of this theme? And one central thread is that everything has a shadow of some kind, and some are more apparent than others, and that can be anything like in the form of haze, or even like through like a wind, and then into kind of like a darker shadow. So just kind of thinking about the whole basis of existence. That's kind of where this project has tapped into with these 9 artists, what they're doing, and just thinking about kind of the basis for nourishment and survival, and just thinking about how those elements really, protect us and protect all things, here. So thinking about, in order to, create these artworks, we need, fire, we need water, the sun is integral. So all these different forces, the air, for the movement. So all these kind of different forces. And so like each piece in this exhibition is bringing that together, really looking at maybe an emphasis on a certain force. I'm just kind of looking around the room and thinking, we're seeing sort of a variety of, earth and fire and sun and sky, and so just kind of bridging all of that together in a close exploration. And, things move so fast. and they always have, but just to take that time kind of as almost a meditation of sorts and a focus on a particular moment in time, that's really been the focus of these artists and what's happening here with bringing the 9 artists together. What are you all looking forward to in terms of future work? How's it looking for moving on in the path for next steps?
Well, at this point, Julie and I have traveled pretty much the whole 1,900-mile border and made images along most of the way. But the ones that we did in the beginning, which were more on the California side, didn't come out. They were either all blue or all white because we were still learning there. So there's certain locations we'll go back to. When that'll be is unclear. There's a lot of other factors in life that make it happen or not happen. But we did in April one where the Rio Grande meets the Gulf of Mexico near Brownsville. I'm right there at that little spot, and it's there's no wall there, but there's a lot of seashells. So like this one's reached, that one is a lot of little shells. And we'd like to go to the San Diego, Tijuana border as well on the ocean. And so those will that'll sort of cap the two ends. And like I said, there'll be maybe between 20 and 30 altogether, maybe 25, and they're all finished. And so yeah, more of that. We've taken lots of notes, but we haven't written anything yet. So will there be writing? Will it be poetry? Will it be essays? Descriptions of people we've met? I'm not sure. But looking forward to figuring that out, doing more, and then finding the best venues to exhibit them, as Brandon said, as a series altogether. So we're working on that, and other than that work, I don't think Julie and I have anything in the works until this one is done. We have done other things together in the past.
Well, it sounds like you're pretty busy. It sounds like even the cyanotypes project alone, if that was the only thing that you were working on, that's quite a feat that you guys are working on. Yeah, it's I feel lucky and privileged that we could do it, and that as we can be traveling on the border in places where the powers that be would rather we weren't, and we have the privilege with our whitish skin and our nice car that we can go to those places and do this documentation without being overly harassed. And I realize that's a real privilege, and I don't want to abuse that, and I want to use that in a way that is useful for a larger conversation.
Yeah. Pottery has always been the escape from architecture for me, right? Not necessarily an escape, but a therapeutic, side thing. And I'm currently starting the process of renovating a house. I'm looking forward to seeing how the creation of spaces actually can sort of influence one another, right? Actually using the clay to fix the house, and using the house to work with the clay. That's the next big project for me. But as far as pottery is related, I've been working on a new sort of technique where I have different slips with different amounts of mica in them. So when I apply them to the clay, certain areas will glitter a little more than the other. Trying to see how to work with that in a way where not only can the clay express the environment, but it can express sort of other symbols within it and on the surface of the clay. And I'm really looking forward to that.
Thank you. Wow. And I just appreciate all the thoughts that you all have shared. And just thinking about place and these different elements, you know, the wind, the fire, the sun, the rain, the snow, all of it, how decisive those are. And I think that's also been another basis, you know, social fabric between everyone here, you know, just thinking about how that changes our practice, how that changes like what we do on a certain day, just kind of really just taking note of that, you know, we follow place, you know, just thinking about it in those terms, and it's different for everybody, but, you know, when it snows here, I can tell you that I try to work from home. It's really windy actually, right at Taos Mountain here. It's quite brisk when it snows, and I'm always reminded what a force that is and how lucky we are to have that here, because that's really quite nourishing for our location here in the high desert, the alpine desert, I've heard it called. So I wanted to open up the floor to questions. Does anyone have questions?
A question for Brandon.
Yeah,
The traditional pottery in the display, what it's not used, didn't use the revolving turntable, the wheel. Do you use that when you do your pottery?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I use sort of a happy medium between modern and traditional, right? So I use a base bowl of puki, and I put it on a sort of cake decorating stand where it's not, you know, it's not powered with any sort of a motor. I just kind of turn it, which certainly helps, but it's fundamentally different from like an electrically powered wheel.
Do you still use a coil method though? Is it
Yeah.
so like a very
use-
thin coil or?
I do a sort of modified coil, and it's kind of always the process with clay, right? So you try something, it works or it doesn't, but I'll use a coil and I sort of flatten it with my hand. So it's sort of, I don't know, rectangular little tube, and I pinch that up. But yeah, it's still super low tech.
Is the very thin wall traditional? Or is that something, I just noticed that they're so fine and delicate, and I'm not clear if that's a traditional method or if that's more personal to you, or.
You know, that's a big sort of internal conflict I have with each pot, because I do want the pots to be used eventually, right? That's sort of the end goal, is that they have a life of their own. But there is this sort of market or like technical aspect of it, right? Where you see a thin pot, like, oh, that's talent, even though, you know,
It may not be as useful.
it may not be as useful, right? And it's function, or it's valued in a different way.
Interesting.
And so I'm trying to find this really thin spot where it's both functional, light, you know, and has that sort of best of both worlds.
Nice.
Since mica has always been utilitarian and in older times used as window panes, and it basically, when you find it out in nature, is like a pane. Do you ever have, or do you come across your clay where you have to actually hand grind it to get the mica finer?
I've certainly found mica, you know, in big blocks, big sheets, but rarely ever do I find it already in the clay in thicker sheets. Usually through the process of the clay actually becoming clay itself, it moves down the mountain. It's always kind of grinding against everything it comes in contact to. So by the time it gets to where I dig it, it's already, you know, tiny. And sometimes I actually have to sift out some of the mica because it's too much like a cookie, or like a sugar cookie almost. It's brittle and it breaks.
Thank you.
So I'll ask Matthew a question. So you landed on cyanotypes for this project, and you had said a while ago that you know, there was the subject matter, and then there was matching the medium to it. So why do you think that cyanotypes became the medium of choice for this project?
Well, I mean, I maybe said this a little before, is the, well, Brandon was pointing out that the blue, there's an erasure of the wall with the blue of the cyanotype. So I think there is something in the blue, whether see that as the blue of the sky, or just a compelling color to engage with in a space like this. So there's that. There's the immediacy of it that in my studio in Santa Fe, we can, tape plastic bags over the windows and make it totally dark in there and mix it up. It's non-toxic. So we're not destroying the world in order to document the world. Hopefully. So there's the non-toxicity, the affordability of it, the relative ease of making it compared to other photographic processes, and the color. It was important to us not to go with a digital camera and take a photograph of the wall and come back and print a negative and then expose that with light in the studio. We didn't want that intermediate. We wanted, as the project is called, direct exposure. We want it to be directly. So there's a physicality of the object that this piece of cloth was in this place at that time. And it's all right there, the same way Brandon's work is all right there. And there's part of him in that and the place that he dug it in Picaris and where he fired it, and how he was at the time in the museum at the time. So the cyanotype is really useful for that. There's actually someone I met here at the opening sent me a thing talking about Edward Curtis photos that in the field, he would make cyanotypes from his negatives to check, just to get a quick visual of it. So it's definitely not the most precious of photographic methodologies. And there's something just sort of rough and tumble about it that appealed to me.
Well, thank you all for being here today. I really enjoyed this conversation, and we're doing 2 more of these talks. The next one will be next Sunday, October 23rd, 1 o'clock with Dora Dillistone and Juanita J. Lavadie. And there'll be 1 more after that on Sunday, November 6th, 1 o'clock with Pola Lopez and Will Wilson. And we'll be posting these programs on our YouTube channel so that they can be watched later. Thank you for joining us for this discussion. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you want to like hold a pot or we can stand in front of her and just capture the moment?
Yeah, thanks for coming.
That's what I want to do. Yeah. And I also want to.
Here.
Yeah.